Kia ora he uri tēnei o Te Atiawa me Taranaki, ko Alice Tupuna Samavula Hau. I teach at the Faculty of Māori and Indigenous Studies at the University of Waikato, and one of the great joys of the last 3 years of my life has been a Marsden-funded project called Writing the New World, Indigenous Texts 1900 to 1975. The project spends time going all around the region, 1900 to 1975, a period that we actually don't know that much about. We spend a lot of time talking about kind of first adventures and connections with Europeans coming into the region, and we talk about more recent things, but particularly in the area of writing and literary studies, which is my own background, it's kind of like what really happened between the end of the kind of contact colonial period and Albert Wendt, like what happened in that time in between. Writing the New World has brought together 16 different Indigenous researchers from all around the region with really different backgrounds and different perspectives and different skills. And the podcast is intended to feature their views, their ideas, their experiences, so that you also can have an opportunity to connect with this writing, but also with the region that it comes from. The whole concept of the podcast is so much that happens at universities, really are things that people beyond the university might be interested in hearing about. We're interested in celebrating the writing from this time period, but also celebrating the work of the amazing researchers that have worked on the project. And so we are hopeful that members of their communities and the members of the communities that produce this writing in the first place would find these podcasts to be interesting, and maybe would have them ask some questions and feel interested in knowing a bit more about the writing of their own communities. In order to contribute to the New Zealand Pacific and Māori Language Weeks, in 2020 a special issue of the podcast is being launched with each of those language weeks, featuring people from those language communities speaking about their research in that language.
Isapula Vinaka, Talafalava. My name is Wanda Yerubia Allen, your podcast host. Happy Fijian Language Week. In celebration of the Fijian literary heritage, Vula Utonivaya and Adi Inoke talk about their archival research experiences with Fijian language text. Both have varied and equally important experiences and findings. One of the many interesting topics of discussion involves a seemingly small but powerful way in which Indigenous Fijian people are speaking back in the colonial government newspaper, Ngā Mata. Vinaka vaka levu Adi and Vula. Thank you for your time and enjoy.
Vula Vinaka.
Okay. Maka Nimbula nadango Vula Utonivaya o nadorogo ni mabuata manetiki no undu no korogu ni kondi au basu I malaita solomoni au sa ngai me mataito ni trimester ni Vulingo University of Waikato o Vulitu kana tamban ni health sciences ona paguna tawa levu ni solo ni tiki no kongo me waitavi na kuni biu sakini writing the new world. Vinaka.
Vinaka ni sambula Vinaka na yadango Adi Inoke ngone leo ni vandu mingau au wasu I navanga koro torongona Vinaka ngoma wa Vinaka take rona na konvina ni Pepa Ungo Alice with Kiwanda mero ni torongona Vinaka ngoma wa madala tak na vudio torada ke o wakanga te kio tikina eu vuli tiko bana tambana ni social science nango major na psychology with human development sakarone no go amba kingo wa bena kataka ni sero ya nango na me o avuli talanga valela ivana Pepa Victor tikino Alice with Kiwanda wa bena kataka ni ngana kana me ndalava na matanga na nungu raida na kamembari tikenda na kawetuki wa tikenda na kawa Pacifica Vinaka.
Vinaka, Vula and Adi, I understand that in different projects that you have been engaging with Fijian language text, and part of Fijian language is an opportunity for us to promote our Indigenous languages. Are you able to share a little bit about, for our Language Week program, the text that you've been involved with? Yeah.
Naka ona, I think it's really important to especially in a context like University of Waikato, to think about Indigenous languages and how we engage with it in our learning and in our research. Kambimbi, it's really important. I mean, most of the time, not saying that researchers from other countries who've done research on our own communities are not important. They are important. They've done the baseline and the basis for learning and studying our own cultures and our own, especially our own languages and dialects and all that. But I think it's important as students in a tertiary institution that we say, if you're Maori, you engage with Maori texts. If you're Pacifica, like Samoan, Tongan, or Hawaiian, or Ni Vanuatu, that you engage with texts that exist in the institution, like here in Waikato Uni or in the library, in the archives. It's really important. The reason is, like, from the perspective of the Writing the New World project, to give a brief history of how I came to be involved in it with the Fijian text. The native text, or the Inoke text, was 2018. We went to Fiji for a conference in USP. After a few days of the conference, we went for the conference dinner. So we were having chat with some of the academics. Then I bumped into an old Fijian scholar, Pio Manoa. He's also from Levu, but he's from a different province. And we were chatting. I didn't know he was a prominent poet. Yeah, and he's like, oh, okay. Have you guys found any text? So the conversation started. Oh, not really. We're looking at. So I thought of one. It was Vitimaka, right? I mean, o Peli Rokoanga. He was one of the students at the Navaloa Seminary in Ra. But they didn't. They found out that from what the earlier researchers said, he wrote his personal journal in his own dialect, which is hard to find back then. People, which was
what period was this?
I think it was in the late 1800s.
Yeah,
because that's when the missionaries were coming in to establish the seminaries, teach the local missionaries to go out and so they taught them how to read and write so I was talking about this with Pio. Then Pio out of the blue, and he was like, there's old vernacular newspaper that used to be circulated on an yearly and monthly basis back in the days. So I was like, oh, my ears. Like someone who's rabbits. They were like, oh, this is exciting. Okay. Same time, okay, let's call the missus, introduce her. You guys have to talk. So we had a talk. One chat led to another, one glass of wine led to another. We ended up in Grand Pacific, drinking a few bottles of wine. He was also interested, because he was like...
conversation keep going.
He was... I'm not sure if people knew him or some people
I went to school with the children,
Okay.
So he was so interested in the conversation that he started talking about the the paper. So it's like, oh, from there, that's how Namata came into being to being part of writing the New World Project.
Vinaka, I was really inspired when I first took the paper, Pacific Text last trimester. I inspired in the sense of where my belonging is, the sense of my belonging, as I'm seeing the Pacific Text that belong to me. And it's our identity, and nobody will run away from their own identity. And engaging with the Pacific Text, my last assignment was for us to write something about our own Pacific Text. So I took myself back to where my husband comes from. And then with that, it was the first film that filmed by Vernico. He's Red Roman, and he was the one who filmed that movie. So I watched the whole 87 minutes of the movie. And I have to sit with my children and engage them with the movie themselves. And then I talked about the movie. As I talked about the movie, and I told them, you know, in my learning, this is what I've learned in school, and I really want to engage myself with you guys. Even my children, that was the first time that my children watched the movie as well. And I've been asking my families and friends, it's really important. Because most of the time we love the novels that the Palani people wrote. You know, they wrote things about their own selves and their own perspective. What I love about our Pacific culture is we have a collective perspective, so we work together as a family. As you know, Pacific people, we're very friendly out of all the people in the world. And I'm proud to be a Pacific person, and I'm proud to be a Fijian. And from after I took the Pacific Text, I was really urged. I urged myself, okay, next trimester I want to take the Pacific, the 300 level. So there was none for this trimester. So instead of taking the Pacific Text paper, so I took the Indigenous Maori paper for this trimester, so that I can still engage myself with the Pacific learning. And sometimes people have their visions and their goals and their dreams of where my learning will be going into. So when I first studied in WinTech, and then I graduated with a diploma in mental health, my heart goes to the people of our Pacific. After I graduated, I have to do something for my people. You know, I don't think so that much more people there are there in New Zealand who wants to look after their own people. So I have a passion to look after my own people. Na dava nanungu buli, na dava na kia mayanga viyao. Mena kola ni yanga viyao, mena yanga verna nungu katamata. Verna luvengu, verna makumbungu, verna wakangu, mena vi katamata Pacifica, Tonga, Samoa, Solomoni. Na viva no keve, meanga kina nungu sasanga. So my goal is for me to graduate next year. And then in order for me to graduate next year, I have to engage myself first with whatever learning is around me. Yeah, Vinaka Faftai.
For me personally, it's been it's an amazing journey in discovering the paper. So we've been traveling in Australia because I heard that there's an embargo on certain access to documents in Fiji, like in the archives.
Okay.
Yeah, even but I'll have to ask again. But since Fiji was a colonial site back then, the colonial administrators sent the papers also to Sydney, because Sydney was the hub for all the colonial administration posts there. So people from Britain would be sent to Australia, from Australia, and here. So we went there, found copies there. So I think the earliest copies are 1800s.
1800s.
Yeah,
Amazing.
1900,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm trying to look at the first original copy. Yeah.
So what year was it first published?
That's what I'm really
Oh,
trying
it's trying to find out.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Because
of
the copies are scattered, so we're trying to actually
put everything together.
Yeah.
And are you finding them at various institutions in the Pacific?
Yeah, especially in Australia, because they were the colonial hub.
Yeah.
They have copies in the New South Wales State Library.
Yes.
One there, and a few copies, a few original copies. And there's a lot of copies in National Library of Australia in Canberra.
Yes.
Then there's a few in what's that? Melbourne City Library, State Library. Yeah.
So, tell us a little bit more of Naumata. Is it a private or a public, a government paper?
It's a colonial administration paper. Yeah. A paper magani onto Naumata into Namona. It's like a colonial
written in Fijian.
Written in vernacular Fijian.
But in their own language.
Yeah, in the vernacular Fijian.
Boleh bara, saya boleh
about na text na it was really interesting because that's what really made me interested in the project. So it's still continuing. There's a lot to read. But there's a few themes in those in the actual newspaper. So they have monthly, because it's a yearly issue with monthly monthly issues also. So what they do is like what they did back then was you can collect all the monthly copies at the end of the year. They would they'd ask you to, if you wanted it to be put in hard copy or soft copy, you could send the whole monthly issues to them, and they'll give you a hard copy. The reason why I say this is because it's clearly articulated. But it's so funny, it's like you could tell who the what's that, the commentators were, or people were editing or writing the paper. Because they'll be like being grumpy. So we do mini paper ni Vinaka. So it's like, it's so dirty. You should keep it properly. And so when we collate it and make a hard copy of it, make the cover,
compile it
make the actual. It'll be looking neat. It's like, there's some grumpy evidence. Which is interesting. There's something really interesting for me personally, like in the sense of the language and the time. These are two important factors for me. Reading the Wulika to Vosa Matuar Mantatu. So like they would say the proper Fijian language, formal Fijian language used, in the address, in the writing, which was great. But then you can also understand the voice, the voice of the paper. Sometimes it's in the vernacular language, but you can tell it's somebody else who's using that language. Because the colonial people, or colonial administrators, when they came in, they learned Rahuligan was Swabiti. So it's quite dictatorial. You guys should do this. Kami ni sawaro titingo mani garun mani tete mani vilakaki. It's like, you should be careful with how you, or with your plantations for the Solva missionary.
It sounds very similar to Wataoni when researchers will talk about in terms of what was often government ordinances.
That's the word.
Yes, they would give instructions to people, so it wasn't published in a way that invited people to provide feedback. Like you were saying, it was dictating a way of life.
So it'll be big. It's quite interesting because you look at the paper and it's the same as today, you know. The similar topics are being discussed. One, the finances of the economy. The other one, the health. News from overseas. You know. And then they have little stories here and there, and which is another topic of discussion. You know, like finding. So 1800 issue 1898 ba. Sa distributor itu natalo kay Sinbad the Sailor. Sinbad. Yeah. So they're talking about, you know. So that's interesting. We're all talking about like stories. I know I'm going a bit.
Yes.
You know. Talong tik na talong kay Sinbad the Sailor. Was it Rudyard Kipling?
Yes.
So Rudyard Kipling was also
very colonial. Yes, very colonial literature.
So talong sa tik. Those are some of his stories, and they have like maybe for every month they would have a like a section of the story. And they'll say, "Oh, it will be continued." You know? Similar setup as a overseas paper. It was more. I've always thought about there's a Reader's Digest. You know?
Yes.
You open a little Reader's Digest and they give you a little
snippets.
What's happening in you know, like politically and administratively, you know.
Were there things in there that surprised you?
A lot, like the language itself. The Osawabiti, and one of the most important thing was the calendar. So all the compilation of the yearly issue. At the first page, they have a calendar itself. So this is what I noticed for every year from the 1800s to 1911, because the years are scattered there. There's no coherent, like you know. I noticed that there's always a page. It's folded in four because it's quite big. So what they did was, which was quite smart, and I thought, at least they're using our. You know, like they were using our lunar calendar, Fijian traditional lunar calendar, and they inserted it into the, what would you say, the Western calendar system, January to Gregorian calendar, January to December,
and had it in Fijian.
So for January, the Fijian.
Interesting.
And on the dates itself, from day 1 to 29, initially I was looking at it's like a dot. Then there's a half dot. Then I was like, then one day it clicked. That's actually the cycle. Yes, Ali tiku to todo the Vula. Beginning, So it was an interesting thing. We wondered non da Vula ba itu kisah mah tadi cuma na kalender mereka. So pertanian and I thought it was an interesting way to incorporate traditional lunar calendar into the Roman Greco calendar system.
Yes, absolutely. Exactly. You're saying it's an interesting point of convergence. In some ways, if it is a colonial newspaper, it's to introduce these new systems to the locals. By mapping onto the indigenous languages of sorts onto that.
So it's like an overlap, So we were just using their their Greco calendar with the traditional lunar calendar. But just incorporating it, which I thought was smart. And I was thinking, so who were the native informers who informed them of our lunar system? Which was interesting,
And one of the most powerful message of that is you see Indigenous voices starting to come through into these texts in small ways. And do you think those Indigenous voices become a lot stronger later on in the publications of the ones you've found? I know it's been really difficult to find some.
Yeah, that's a good question. One thing I've wrestled with the idea that sometimes non-visibility doesn't mean absence. Doesn't mean that the name of say Rusiat Natakalo is not there, or Luke Vendriaki is not there. Doesn't mean that they're not there.
Right. Yes.
But doesn't mean that they are absent. Their influence can still be there via because colonial administrators. They have people who come there to translate. But when it comes to the actual document, it's Arthur Gordon,
that's right.
or whoever else. Which is what it was back then. But we shouldn't. I feel like we shouldn't think that we were absent. No, we were present. But that's what I found also, in the text itself. Like because people were given opportunity to write to the editor, and the editor's name was Ratu Namata. So Nimbulu Vinaka Ratu Namata. Sampai sonung itu, alor itu ni sona. So berna vakapamatil tu arali melibuka. Kento melu muyuche. So berna vakapamatil tu arsali soli sente tu governo monela. So they go to church, the government workers. So this is someone from the village complaining to Ratu Namata. And he's saying, some of your workers are coming to church and then showing coins to the girls after church.
Like tipping them.
to entice them to have a conversation with them. So I was like, that's interesting. So then you see Ratu Namata in the next thing writing back to them. It'd be advisable that you villagers look after your girls. No responsibility there. But then there's another letter back from someone from the village. It will be also advisable for government to tell its workers to, not to engage with the local girls and whichever place they go to. So it's a subtle, like pushback from people in the community, which is, So I think sometimes some of these kind of papers, or some of these texts, they would, even though it's using our own vernacular, it underestimates the knowledge and the power of the communities involved. So naran beta juga na watangin di kelas yang buku. Yor tahu That's one thing I've really learned is like
And I guess this is why it's important that Indigenous Fijian speakers and readers and writers investigate these texts, because they bring with it their lenses to understand the context of that statement. Because if I assume correctly, what you're saying is it may seem like a light rebuke, but contextually in the culture, it's a lot more severe than that. Would that be the case?
Yeah, I think you're right in saying that. We have different ways of addressing issues in our own communities. Like maybe one community in the Fijian community has its own ways. In the different levels, you have the Vanua, and you have the church, and then you have the Matentu, which is the government, and you have the family. These are all important places where issues are dealt with. When there's, when one of these institution, may I say, is absent in the process, it affects the community. And I think, learning about this in this kind of texts like Namata is quite interesting. As a student and as a Itoke or Indigenous or Native Fijian, I've always used the analogy of a window. Like when you open the window, you're opening a window to the world out there. So Namata was like a little world that I never knew existed. Or it existed, but I was not aware of it. But now it's like it's really good. Like there's a lot of things you can learn from old texts. People would say, "Oh, it's just old newspaper. What can you really learn about it?" Live to nakandar ni ulit make it. Umdanga wasantaka matai the history, because these are from the 1900s, and it's of an era and a time. There are certain things that happened back then that you can read about and understand. Gives you a basic understanding of what actually happened, why, and if you were to trace existing issues from now back to then, that can inform you how things have transpired, because the lack of measures put in place to address, economically, health-wise and all that. So it's like, but for me, that historically, it's quite important to look at those kind of documents. And waksamtamdan bula socially. Back then, arsate ko bitang tagunda na pepa na bula ningunyangon. The drinking of kava. That was one issue. There's a lot of people. And surprisingly, the use of opium.
Back then,
Back in,
wow, okay.
Nakanabang take na opium. Opium kondo na hingangan ni pamatinta. Yung ko tomo erna turangan ni China. Chinese.
And the indentured laborers came through that as well.
The Chinese.
Interesting.
Chinese people who brought in migrants, who were farmers and builders. So they would use it as a way to relax, and some native Fijians.
Overuse it.
And you're like, and they will say,
mixed it with the kava.
well, I wonder if we mix it with the kava.
That would be something interesting.
But it's quite interesting in the context of that, like the public health public health announcements that were made. So it's like, there's too many Fijians drinking kava, and there's the influence of the Chinese migrants with the opium, and it's like, I didn't know opium existed back then. So in terms of like now in Fiji, there's an issue with P, methamphetamine. So it's like, but we also have history of opium use in our country. Because I have a health background, so
that's how you know.
That's like something I'm like, it's interesting to also learn about what were the health issues back then. What was the diet, because this can also inform us. So as a student of maybe public health or health population, you were talking about the measles outbreak, took over like 40,000 people. Kala nonrendu vanonum sunave kupoa, nonramate. Kala may Suba in the cemetery. There's a spot there. Koi Utonivaya. There's a mount there. They say. It's a mass grave where people were.
Did you know the something? No,
that's what they said. So we'll have to answer. That's one thing I want to research more on. How. But from some paper articles I read in Fiji Times, because this is how I came to, because from engage with it, because Namata is talking about the big measles outbreak. But then recently, earlier this year, they were talking about that same measles outbreak. So the connection there was like, oh, so because villages commemorate that time when the measles outbreak nearly decimated most of our communities. So they would have church services to commemorate and remember those who
Those
passed
who
on.
already passed on that particular.
So many years back.
Yeah, I think it's only my village, out of all the village, one Vandra. So we have a big stone like to commemorate because our village was not affected by the measles. So our village was one of the villages out of all the villages in Fiji. So we've got a big memorial stone there.
And this is why it's important that we understand, Indigenous people conduct archival research, because we have these memories. Contrary to what Vula, the story in Ngāmata, in terms of decimation, there are other stories of cultural resilience. So although we were vulnerable to all these harms, there are also stories about resilience and survival as well. And I guess this is why it's really important that people with that cultural knowledge, that history, are able to plug in the parts, because although these we hear our voices in there, they're very contested sites. You can hear, like you were saying, Vula, the interpreters, the Balangi writers obviously got that knowledge from someone. And so the notion of absence, we can still, as Indigenous readers and writers, you can hear, like you were saying, you can hear and you can read their voices still coming through. But someone who does not have that background will not hear or see that. So
I think what's important is Indigenous Maori or Pacific student or Aboriginal student, maybe, that when you come to do learning in an institution, you kind of have a different perspective or different lens, because your worldview is completely different. So I think I think we can be successful in universities and other parts if we engage with that perspective. Because our ancestors were quite involved with the environment. They were quite connected to the environment. Everything about their life was informed by the environment and the spiritual realm. And that's why we talk about mental health issues. We need to think about individuals' health and community health in the aspect of a holistic aspect. What is affecting our youth? Why are they feeling? Is there a disconnection? And sometimes we have to relearn our own histories to understand why we or where we at right now and where we've come from. And that's for me. I always use the analogy of a window. It's like when you open that window, you're looking back into history. And sometimes, I've realized I have this bias, and I'm like, oh, it's an old newspaper. What's the use of that? But then after going through Namaka, I'm like, wow, it's really interesting. It's making you think about, because we can talk about the paper whole day. Because it talks about provincial appointments. Back in the days they would have Buli. Buli means the people who are chosen as the district representatives. Buli Undu, Buli Ngau. So it's interesting to see familiar names, names that I'm not related to, but names who
already there.
Or people or Sirwakula, Visikula, all these names of prominent Fijian families. It's like, so they've been involved in government administration for a long time. Then you hear like Fijian judges, Fijian doctors, and how the colonial administrators Nondra so villagers were assigned to look after. Or you plant a yam plot or cassava plot or taro plot for the district rep or the missionaries. So this is the amount of coconuts you collect, copra, for your tax. You know? So instead of money, you plant or you collect
coconuts.
And you know, it's like there's so much to learn about how things were done back then. I'm not saying that colonial administrators, I mean, there was a colonial imposition, but there's we have to live with that fact. We are what we are today because of that. We cannot change it, but there are things we can, you know, the good and the bad.
But as an Indigenous person looking into those archives, you immediately see the connections, like you're saying, you know, and it starts different conversations, you know. So you understand, like you're saying, particular families who are looking after this, but also in terms of the reason why we're producing this particular products is because maybe New Zealand needed it. So then you start about connections, not only in terms of families, but exporting of goods, you know, Fiji's contribution to agriculture everywhere else in the Pacific. Who were they feeding? You know, like the other New Zealand, I suppose, colonies, part of the New Zealand imperial system is Niue was feeding a lot of New Zealanders, but people didn't know. So these are the regional parts of the Pacific that we often, and it goes back to the idea of how the Pacific were always connected in different ways. So like you're saying, Vula, it starts different types of conversation that only us as Indigenous people can have.
There's because our people and our context are the subject of that the paper in that time, and even though it also had news, but it was always about our people back then. And I think it's important for whatever field you involve in studies, or even when you're working and you want to understand a bit more. It's always good to research into this kind of papers because it'll give you hints about, because it's the news of the times, you know? The time that they're living in.
Although through those colonial histories we can still hear our Pacific voices. We just have to learn to read and listen to them and figure out what they mean, because one word in particular may mean something completely different. It opens up, as we know, with our language, it's rich with symbolism and imageries. That one word opens up, like you were saying, opens up a window to a whole different world that's often closed to the Bali reader.
And I think, not saying that my perspective is right or the only perspective, because I've engaged with it. That's, at this moment, but I'll also be excited to see and hear the perspective of other people who will engage with the text in a different way. Different, like Itoke or Fijians or Samoans or Rotumans or Indo-Fijians, because it's all about us. But the important thing is that we engage with it, that we learn something from it and we utilize what we've learned from our future, I think, I think that's an important thing. As a student here in thinking about language, it's so rich in the language, like we would say in Fijian, wasamatua, Fijian words that are quite have deep meaning and grounded, That's one thing I've really enjoyed about reading the paper. And also, I found out knowledge nunggu research. Angay so na was paling balik proverbs isa na ba bichim ta. Ambo interesting to. So because people would write back and forth to edit, donongona sangewu kasa. So this person was talking about some issue he disagreed with, and then he used this traditional proverb. Arnanga hivi mbali tinga waka na vundi ni bengvani.
Vundi ni bengvani.
Pani koko tokana lagi. Era sini dulu era lutunga kuna koko kita. Na
vundi ni bengvani. Ni vundi ni lili toko ya.
Bambi tokana sana. So it's like a plantain, The person who was writing said, oh, they'll all fall like the winds of the plantain. Because the plantain, when the plantain is on the tree, it'll lean on one side, So if the winds are strong, it'll all fall on one side. So he was implying that, oh, they'll all fall together on one side. There's a subtle way to push back to a certain conversation that was happening. Which I found really interesting. As Itoke is like, wow, that's so deep in meaning. It's like because you wouldn't hear that nowadays.
It's very hard to hear this kind of conversation.
So much. So that's another thing I like really thought about was picking up this little gem of proverbs, little gems, and like thinking, okay, one day I might put together, collect it. It's not like new. Some of them, have been. I've heard of them. So like in Totalugo, do klenga na wanga, may na volau, kena kau etame kina. The tradition. Another one was like, you'll know about or waka by the shed and the tree that it was cut from.
Oh wow. So that's quite profound, isn't it?
You'll be known by the place where you come from.
Yes. So a lot of parallels with other Pacific cultures as well, but it's grounded in the environment, like you say.
So that's why I was saying, like, because our ancestors were quite connected to the environment. So they are wairua, the spiritual being, and the physical being is informed by the environment. Mother Earth and Father Sky and all that,
he was saying the connection, This from the written text that she's talking about. Dad went back to the village 2 years ago.
Okay.
After 42 years. So he went back to the land of his dad. And then there's a particular land where they say that they can hear people laughing and talking to each other, unseen. So Dad went through those places and Dad heard them laughing. Laughing, and somebody is talking to somebody, and Dad told them, "You all shut up now. I'm here now." See, that's it's real.
Yes.
After 42 years, Dad went back to that village. So he heard what he haven't heard for a very long time.
That's quite powerful, isn't it?
A connection,
I think it's important. That's why I also like always, like here in Waikato, we on Tainui land. It's always important to acknowledge where Vanua, the land we're in, or on, because kada wulangi tuge, so we always know our place, how we conduct ourselves in this context.
So thank you, that's been an awesome conversation. So probably one question I'd like to ask you both is, what would you, and I know you're starting your journeys as researchers now, what would you like to tell probably your children's generation about the importance of Indigenous texts?
Dana Nogurai, Nanganigulitoke. Levu sara ilasa sini levu vekenda menda koti kenda lestal wana nanda ngole mikila nanda yavu dana ka bimbi menda huli dana ka membaleta na nanda itogna toke leta kenda tiko na nanda bononda la mikina tiko na nanda yasana tiko na nanda tikina tiko na vika membaleti kenda dina ninda same itu ini silandi nda kova kandoni na lulunga na nonda itovo. Something that I want to address to our children, our grandchildren, our whanau here in New Zealand, for us to engage with our own culture. Not only the culture, our language, our text, And for us to know the importance of our history, because since Vula was just having the conversation of the written text that he's engaging in and doing his research on, for us to know how important it is, it will be useful in the future. So for example, we were just about to go to attend a tangi at one on Lina where is dead. And then our vice president for the Fijian Association turned back to me. How do I present a cover? And I said, I was brought up in Suva, I really don't know much. And I said, go to Dr. Google. That's really shameful, you know, for a Fijian to go back to Dr. Google and give Dr. Google will give us the answer. It's really important for us to engage with our own text and, you know, to know where we come from. And if we really don't know anything, we keep researching, we keep searching.
Well, that's a really important question. Tarunaka Matai, well, the first is before the 10 years. I need to start now in trying to embed some language base for her, talk to her in Fijian. And ensure that I know the reality is we are in the diaspora and the pool to speak English is far greater, but that doesn't mean that I can't do anything about it. I still can do something about it. And 10 years from now I feel like there'll be a lot of headaches on me. She'll be a big girl and you know she thinks she's adult, but yeah, that's a fact I have to, you know, we have to think about as indigenous or native peoples in our diaspora is what can we do to ensure that our kids or our future generations understand our languages and our culture. And one thing is to start from home, just do the basics, you know, teach them little things about, you know, saying thank you. Or, Alice has been quietly telling me recently, so, we need to, you know, ensure we keep speaking a lot more Fijian because she's in daycare now. So the language of instruction and conversation is mostly English. And the other day I was sneezing because I was like, oh, bola, tumbu. Which is life and no growth. The second sneeze. So all of a sudden she's like, oh, bola tata.
Oh, good.
I sneezed again and she said, tumbu. Sneeze again? And I said like, okay, achoo. And she said, tumbu. And I thought, oh, it is. I know, like, we were laughing, we were laughing away. And I thought to myself, well, it's this kind of moments that the language and the culture registers with them. So it doesn't have to be big, it has to be a little. Kalau leitongan akan rentakapan. Now was dokter kuna naka. So okay. Oh, naka tata naka. I was like, oh, okay, naka leo naka. And you know, I can understand the pressure from the other side. She'll be like, oh, you know, our communities can lose our language in one generation. And I also know that you can also teach a generation, you know, don't have to worry about the pressure, you worry about what we can do. So, you know, as for students who are here in uni, say Fijians, Maori or Pacifica, you know, you'll say, oh, my parents don't speak the language or I can't understand it. I say, yeah, that's a fact. But we have to start somewhere, you know, and by that, you get a book or start learning it, take Maori 100, you know, Pacifica, or join some, you know, try to talk with someone who knows the language, you know. You don't have to to underestimate your lack of not knowing your culture or your language. All you have to have first is the desire to learn.
Yeah. Tēnā sara.